Hello, Natasha. Thank you for coming along.
Hello.
I'd like to introduce Dr. Natasha Carver, who is at the University of Bristol in the School for Policy Studies, and whose book is, by the time you'll be watching this, hot off the press. It's called Marriage, Gender and Refugee Migration, and it's published by Rutgers University Press. And we're going to talk a little bit about it. So thanks for coming along again. And perhaps we could start, Natasha, by you telling us what the main argument of your book is.
So my book looks at the reproduction of culture following migration. So several academics have observed that the cultural practices of any group are subject to challenge when the members of the group sort of interact with outsiders. So in any society, you have a consensus on the gender order. So talking about the gender order, I kind of mean there kind of a system in which power relations between men and women are made meaningful ideologically and materially. And usually that gender order is kind of hidden in plain sight. It's just become so naturalized that it goes unnoticed. But for migrants, what it means to be a man or a woman is challenged when they relocate because they've moved from one gender order to another gender order. And for some migrations, obviously that's quite a subtle process or a subtle thing, but for others it's a massive sort of dislocating shock, which gives rise to something of a kind of existential crisis. And my contention is that this is experienced most keenly in intimate relationships, so especially between partners or husbands and wives, because the family is the key site where gendered identities are typically maintained and reproduced. So what my book is it considers how culture and gendered identities are sort of contested, negotiated, and reproduced following refugee migration. So I'm really interested not just in sort of acknowledging or proving that happens, but exposing how it happens. So unpicking the kind of mechanisms, if you like, of the regendering process.
So what led you to this research field?
Well, before academia, I worked as an immigration caseworker for 10 years, first with the Immigration Advisory Service and then with Southwest Law. And I had lots of, most of my work was either in asylum or giving advice on family applications, family immigration applications and appeals. So representing people in court, helping them make their applications for visas for their family members, etc. And in Bristol, when I moved to Bristol, a lot of my clients were Somali because we have a large Somali population here in Bristol. And they really, they surprised me in many ways. They blew aside sort of the assumptions and of stereotypes that I had about Muslims and Muslim women in particular. So Somali women who were my clients, they were full of agency. They were really assertive and very pragmatic about their marriages and what they wanted out of those marriages. But at the same time, anyone who works in immigration casework knows that Somalis find it particularly difficult to have successful applications, and they are actually the nationality that sees the most refusals in marriage applications in particular, but family applications across the board. And that's been shown by Catherine Charsley, who did some work on that, and she actually showed that Somali marital applications are refused over 60% of the time. And this is far off the chart compared to other nationalities. So the next closest nationality was, I think it was Bangladeshi, around 40%, going right down to sort of Americans who are sort of refused 0.5% of the time. And I sort of started wondering, what's going on here? Why is it so, why are Somalis being refused so much? Obviously, quite a lot of that is to do with the institutional racism, which really is at heart of the decision-making process, particularly in the Foreign Office abroad in Addis Ababa and places like that. But I also thought, that is true also of my, Iranian clients, my Nigerian clients, all these other clients, but Somalis seem to be particularly affected and with really unfair decisions. And it crossed my mind that maybe these women who were making these applications, these men and women who were making these applications, weren't living up to the stereotype that the decision maker had of what a Muslim woman and a Muslim marriage and a Muslim man sort of looks like in their eyes. And so therefore they were being refused on the grounds that their marriages weren't genuine because they didn't fulfill the stereotype of a Muslim marriage for that particular border official. So that was my sort of idea, and I really wanted to explore that further. So that's basically how I got into the whole research. But then when I went out there armed with my information sheet and my kind of project information, and went and spoke to all these Somali men and women about what was going on, that wasn't what they wanted to talk about at all. And they my research said in big letters at the top, this research is about Somali marriage. And a lot of people responded by saying, oh yeah, divorce, it's a big problem. So I followed that lead. Basically, it was sort of inductive research, and I followed that lead and explored these notions of what was going wrong in their rise in terms of Somali marriages once they'd following migration. And this led to this analysis of this kind of regendering process and cultural reproduction.
So can you tell us a bit more about that? Like, what were the key insights that you had on the gender, on the kind of gender regendering of your Somali participants?
Well, I think the prevailing political discourse in Europe positions Muslim family life as backward and Islamic practice as kind of regressive. And we can see that in things like the Casey report, which came out in 2016, which actually uses the word regressive quite a lot to talk about Islamic praxis. And Muslim family life is in particular seen as kind of incompatible, if you like, with so-called Western values. And the findings from my book really challenge that discourse. In particular, I show how the female participants are using Islam to radically alter their gender ideologies and the ways in which their intimate spousal relationships work. So women, far more than men, were much more likely to talk to me and to bring in Islam into sort of everyday conversations and the Quran and the words of the Prophet. And they utilized this knowledge of their religion to talk back to their husbands and to talk back to what they understood as kind of traditional Somali culture, which they thought was not following Islam. And so I wouldn't say it was feminist exactly, but it was quite feminist, a kind of like Islamic feminism, if you like, which was sort of, they were using Islam to further their position and their strength and their power as women in their marriages and in the wider world. So, for example, people would tell me, I mean, from the smallest little things like, it's not in the Quran that the women should be washing the dishes every night. Our Prophet Muhammad, he helped out his wife, he washed the dishes, so small little things like that, but all the way right up to the big issues like the right of women to go out and work, or the right not to be subjected to rape within marriage. So from the smallest domestic issues right to the biggest sort of gender topics, women were using Islam to sort of talk back to cultural misogyny and change their lives as a result.
So one of the things that I think is really unusual about your book, and which I really loved, was your writing of your participants' words as poetry. It's just really striking and actually beautiful poetry. So can you tell me why you did that, and what gave you the idea, and why did you decide to do that?
Yeah, well, that was quite a long journey. So I had no intentions to do that at the outset, but when I was, I recorded my interviews, or majority of them, and when I was listening back, I really noticed a kind of musicality. I think that's what hit me first. There was often rhythm where I wasn't expecting it, and just a kind of general sense of musicality. And my first idea was that I wanted to convey that to the reader. I thought if I just put these words on the page, I'm going to lose so much of this meaning that I can hear in the way that the participants are talking. And so I thought, well, I could write it out annotate it like it's a musical score. So, you know, have the words and have a sort of pitch sort of line, and maybe some intonation and some louds and softs, and, you know, all of that. But then I thought, actually, that's being quite exclusive, because if you don't read, you know, if you can't read music, then am I sort of limiting people from being able to access what I'm actually saying? And does the text become too clustered and it's not really, you know, it's not really conveying what I wanted to say? So I started reading more broadly. I was doing narrative analysis anyway, and I remembered that Catherine Reisman had talked about something called ethnopoetics. So I went back to that, and then I explored that further through the work of James Gee and others. And I realized that actually there was poetry there already. I don't think I was kind of creating poetry. The poetry was already there. It just had to be presented on the page, if you like. So what I did was I went back to my audio recordings, and I listened to them again and again and again, and I transcribed them in little intonation units. So when we speak, we naturally go up and down, and we pause, you know, in order to make sense of what we're saying. And in English, each little intonation unit conventionally is like a clause. It doesn't have to be, but it generally kind of is. But for speakers who are speaking English as a second language, the intonation becomes even more important, because if you can't speak fluently, you can't articulate exactly what you want to say in any language, you'll find that you use expression a lot more, you use dynamic, you use intonation an awful lot more in order to make sure your point has been understood and to get your point across. And it's also the fact that Somali itself is a very poetic language. It wasn't written down until 1972. And it didn't get an alphabet until that date. And a lot of people still rely on poetry. I mean, oral poetry was the way history was told, the way children were taught key lessons about socialization and everything. And there was a lot of, you know, proverbs and stuff that happen anyway in society. And that's still true today. So when I re-listened to these participants and put their words into these little intonation units, I realized not all of them, but some of them were actually speaking in poems. You know, there was rhythm and the same rhythm patterns. There was often alliteration, which is a key feature of Somali poetry. And there was a sort of clustering, if you like, of things that kind of to make emphasis and stuff like that. So there was a lot of poetry already there. And so I really was really pleased to have found this method, because I think one of the mistakes we often make as sociologists is we transcribe what is an oral delivery in our interviews into a written format, which ends up as prose. And people don't speak in beautiful prose on the whole. You know, I mean, maybe a politician does because they've got a prepared speech, but most of us, we make little mistakes. We say things twice. We use repetition. We use emphasis to make the points that we want to make. And all of that gets lost if you transcribe it into prose. And if you put it back in the context in which it was spoken, you begin to see sometimes even a different meaning, you know, but definitely some texts, which, for example, could be interpreted in 2 or 3 directions, get a rather different interpretation if you look at it in this sort of poetic rendering. And the other aspect was, so I took Reisman's ethnopoetics and I kind of developed them. I was really concerned with representation and how I represent participants' voices. So I wanted to kind of, I mean, this idea of being true, but then at the same time, I'm transcribing, I'm still interpreting, you know, still doing all that kind of work that an academic, a sociologist has to do. And I didn't want to sort of hide behind poems that looked like I had no say in their sort of creation, if you like, because I saw the interview very much as a joint production. The data was, you know, produced between me being me and all the things that I bring to the interview, and the other person, all the things that they brought to the interview, and the space in which the interview took place as well. All these a dynamic, if you like, coming together. So one of the ideas of mine was to take the basis of ethnopoetics, but actually put it onto the page in quite a specific way, sort of recalling the idea of concrete poetry, what's called concrete poetry, which is where you produce a poem in the form that, so there's a very famous one by a French poet called Il pleut, and it rains, and the words actually, you know, they rain down the page like raindrops. So the idea to reproduce the poem as to the theme of what you're talking about. So that was a way of breaking down that fourth wall, of like withdrawing attention, drawing the reader's attention to the fact that I was there, and I as an author, I was always present in that production of the text.
It works beautifully, I have to say. And I love the way that hesitations have meaning in music, so that if you'd written it as prose, then you would have people going, yes, and I don't know, you know, it would look hesitant, and yet the way that you've worked with it, it's actually just beautiful, like I say. So I really think that's a really lovely, very inspiring aspect of the book. Just thinking back to the kind of more substantive contribution, or the more intellectual contribution, perhaps I should say. In the book, you talk about doing family. Could you explain what you mean by doing family and how that differs between women and men for your participants?
Yeah, well, the concept of family as a verb rather than a noun is quite well established in British sort of sociology of the family. And the idea being that if we consider family as a noun, as we did and we still do often and have done, we can't help but consider it as static and unchanging. So talking about the family is a re-articulation of whatever the consensus is on what constitutes family. But we know, you know, we know ourselves, families come in all shapes and sizes and formats. But more than this, they're not constituted by their members or their members' sort of formal relationship to each other. They're constituted by their practices of family life and the display of those practices. So doing family is a way of thinking about family as a verb, and doing family is a way of drawing attention to the fact that it's always evolving and that it's through the practices of family life that we constitute family. And traditionally, that has been a very gendered process in many societies, in the UK definitely, where you've had, you know, man as breadwinner and woman as homemaker or carer. So that is also true in Somalia, but what it meant to make a home and what it meant to breadwin were actually quite different things to what we might have said in the UK. And so even so, the kind of the overarching concept had similarity, if you like, from movement from one society to the other. What actually constituted those roles, those breadwinning and homemaking roles, was really different. And this was particularly the case for the women. So the men, by and large, the role was the similar or the same, and it was rather lack of access to it and ability to fulfill it that was the problem. So refugee men, we know, suffer from not being able to access jobs at the same level as the qualifications that they have. So, you know, we have people with degrees in physics and astroengineering and stuff driving taxis, for example, or not being able to access the job market at all. So for them, it wasn't the fact their role hadn't changed, it was just access to the fulfillment of that role. But for women, the mothering role changed massively, because mothering in Somalia was seen as very much a community practice that was, you know, supported by a wealth of people. And a lot of my participants talked with nostalgia about that aspect. Even, you know, from the very rich people to the very poor people, they all had a kind of nostalgia for this community mothering practice. Whereas they found that in the UK, mothering was a really isolating experience. And that was partly to do with the layout of housing, for example. So they were kind of stuck in small flats and the doors were closed, rather than sort of more open space living. But partly also to do with the lack of relatives. So the very fact of migration and the war as well, they'd lost sort of elder support systems which would have been there for them previously. And they also were entering a society where the couple is really seen as important in our kind of family unit, the kind of spousal couple, in a way that they hadn't experienced in Somalia. So some of them said, for example, that their closest relationships in Somalia for women had been with other women, whereas in the UK, they felt entirely reliant on their husband, and for both emotional support as well as practical support. And that put a lot of pressure and strains on the relationship. But there were also things they really liked about it too. So, for example, they really, although they felt isolated, they also really appreciated the privacy and not having neighbours sort of barging in on them at any time and things like that. So there were pros and cons, but the doing of family and the doing of motherhood and the doing of fatherhood had really changed for them fundamentally, and that really caused them to question their whole notion of what it meant to be a woman, and what it meant to be a man.
That's really interesting. And of course, most of your participants were refugees. So what do you think the consequence of being a refugee from Somalia was for intimate relationships, or did it have any consequence at all?
Yeah, well, I think there's been, in migration scholarship, there's been a lot of talk about transnationalism, and a lot of the sort of thinking around transnational ways of being and belonging presumes that all migrants can experience transnationalism in much the same way. So whether you're an elite migrant or a poor migrant, you know, your access to telephone calls, for example. I mean, vertivet calls, cheap telephone calls, the social glue of migrant transnationalism. But what we miss in that story is the experience of refugees, because refugees, you know, they can't just visit home like other migrants can. And it's not just about cost. You know, if they are actually legally a refugee, then they would lose their status and not be able to return if they visited home. So that's a barrier. But obviously there's a war. If there's still a war on, then the violence itself is a barrier if they still fear for their life. And they can't just pick up the phone always and call either. So there might be, all of my participants had experience of losing people on a temporary basis. So I don't mean people who've died here. Obviously, they all had experience of losing family members in that way as well, in the war and the conflict, but they also had experience of being out of touch and out of contact with people for prolonged periods of time due to displacement. And it takes years often to find people again once you've been displaced, because you know, you get displaced to all corners of the world, and it can take a long time for people to reconnect. And then when they do reconnect, their quality of communication is not always the same as it might be for other migrants. So the nature of the conflict itself means that some people are continuously being displaced. So you might connect one week and then the next week they've had to change location, and so therefore they're not connectable again. Or it might be that people are having to share phones, for example, and therefore that phone gets moved with another person, and that's no longer a point of contact for your family member. So it's both in terms of quantity and ability, but also in terms of the quality of the connection. And I think that pushes people to rely more on a kind of imagined belonging, an imagined sort of diasporic sense of belonging, rather than being able to sort of uphold instant communication. So if we compare it to a non-refugee migrant population that has like a large family stream, for example, we might say Pakistanis, for example, in the UK, they are able to travel back home to visit relatives, maybe even choose spouses from their home country. They can bring over religious ministers if they want sort of cultural reinforcement, or they've got a whole system of elders in place. So if they've got problems in their marriages, they can phone up the person who's going to help them most and give them the advice. And that kind of is a way that the culture is reproduced through all those mechanisms. Whereas the Somalis were finding that when they had marital problems, they couldn't utilize the mechanisms they would have utilized in Somalia. So instead, they were turning to their peers or their siblings rather than their parents, which meant that the advice was coming from someone who's generationally the same age rather than the sort of older generation. And in terms of religion, they weren't relying on Somali religious authoritative figures. They were instead going to the Quran itself, or looking on the internet for other sort of Islamic preachers and following their advice. So that meant that the authority sort of the country itself has, a kind of reproducer of culture, was kind of lost or changed or qualitatively altered through the refugee sort of process. And everybody that was therefore turning to slightly different ways. And also because of the spread of Somalis across the globe, because of the refugee crisis produced, Somalis are sort of spread out everywhere. People were calling for advice, from someone who might be in the US, in Dubai, and so where cultures were also influencing those opinions. So they had a lot more difference of opinion and change going on in terms of like upholding their marriages and upholding transnational ways of being and belonging.
I wonder if that goes part of the way to answer my last question, which is precisely about how your Somali participants understood the relatively high proportion of divorces in the Somali community.
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing to say about that is there isn't actually any evidence that there is a high rate of divorce. The participants had a perception that there was a very high rate of divorce, but, we don't actually have facts and figures on that. I think one of the, what I tried to do, because I, in the book, was to consider these stories about divorce as cultural phenomenon themselves. They were there, if you like, to limit and to control the change. So one of the first things I noticed was that everybody kept telling me the same story of divorce. So when they talked to me about divorce, and often this was because I was still trying to follow my plan for like marriage and immigration rules and stuff like that, and they just start talking about divorce and they tell me the same story. And it never happened to anyone they knew. It wasn't like, oh, my friend Ahmed, he had this experience, this is what happened to him. It was just generic. So they were like, oh, there's this kind of person, Natasha, they come here, they do that, And there's one for the man and one for the women. And the man was generally a cat chewer, so he chewed the drug cat, which is like a leaf, which Somalis chew, which kind of causes insomnia and a kind of generally sort of good feeling, but often from my participants' perspective also renders the men fairly useless in terms of helping out at home or being productive in the workplace and that kind of thing. So the bad man, the quintessential sort of bad husband, if you like, was a cat chewer who migrated and lost everything because of the refugee migration, was unable to work, and so therefore took to chewing cat and just chewed it non-stop and just slept all day and was useless and of no assistance to the wife at all. When the wife sort of story, the other gendered story, was to do with a woman who came to the UK and got kind of drunk almost, if you like, on the powers afforded women in the West, and was so in love with her freedom that she just abandoned her children and her husband and went to live the good life. So it wasn't possible to find any actual people that happened to, but these stories were immensely powerful stories that circulated in the group, repeatedly and told not just to me, but also when I was sitting in group, within groups, I could hear them being sort of re-articulated or referred to amongst the group as well. So I see these stories more as less as kind of truth and more as kind of a way that the culture sort of limits the fallout, if you like, from this change in gender order. So these stories regulated and disciplined people who might be thinking about, either chewing cat or not being good husbands, essentially, or or not being good mothers and staying with the family and good wives. So it was a way of kind of disciplining people. And it was also a way in which participants were able to sort of draw distinctions from themselves to this nondescript bad sort of husband or wife. So they could, you know, tell this story and then make reference to their own life and their own successes and failures in relation to that. So even when there were failures within their own life, like for example, if they hadn't managed to secure the job that they wanted, they were nonetheless not a kind of terrible failing father figure or husband, because they weren't this capture person. They were still, you know, so it was a kind of a way of comparing their own selves as well.
Thank you. That's just, it's such a fantastic book, Natasha, and I really recommend people go and read it and use it for teaching and enjoy the poetry. So thank you for coming along to talk about it with us.
Thank you very much for having me.